What if I told you that you could have a camera that's compact, that has a lens that delivers razor-sharp images, the camera looks striking, and it's just as simple as you could imagine, all in one toddy package? Welcome to the Contax T2, a camera where you can have everything, but it'll cost you. In today's video, we're going to talk about why the Contax T2 may be the perfect compact camera, and also why almost nobody should buy it. Let's get into it. First, let's talk a little bit about the background and the history of the Contax T2. And for those of you who may not know, in the recent past, I made a video going over the whole history of Contax. Just one video dedicated to Contax, and I'm going to link that at the end. Contax is a historical camera mark that got its start as a camera brand in the Zeiss Icon camera line. There was a licensed branding deal, and then eventually Kyocera continued to manufacture products under the Yashica and Contax brands. In the mid-1980s came the Contax G1. It had wonderful, gorgeous good looks, a titanium body, and Carl Zeiss lenses, a formula that we will see again in the future. The first Contax T was a 35mm rangefinder camera released in the 1980s. The body is available in various different colors and finishes. The Contax T2 is a compact camera released in 1991, the much anticipated sequel to the T1. And for those of you who are concerned, there's also a T3, but we're not going to get bogged down with that in this video. And the Contax T series is a series of semi-professional, premium point-and-shoot cameras made by Kyocera. And if just being an awesome historical camera mark with a wonderful name brand lens from Carl Zeiss wasn't enough, fast forward to 2017, there's a story concerning the Contax T2 that I think everybody knows at this point. The Contax T2 entered the mainstream officially when supermodel/influencer Kylie Jenner used the camera to snap photos of Jimmy Fallon on a primetime television show. This was the moment that formally announced to the world that film photography was back in style, and the camera to have was the Contax T2. And you can imagine what that's done to prices ever since. And because I'm a sucker, I bought one. Not because of or in spite of that story. And that's basically the 2-minute explanation of where the Contax T2 came from. But let's start talking about some of the features of the Contax T2 that I've got right here in front of me. First, let's talk a little bit about the aesthetics. And I mean, it goes almost without saying that this thing is just gorgeous. I have the black version here, but the version of the Contax T2 that you're most likely to encounter is the champagne gold finish. But there are also 2 additional finishes that you're less likely to encounter. There's a much darker black version. This is more of a graphite, and I hope that shows up well in the video clips. But there's like a proper space black, I guess, if you go into the Apple range. But there's also like a really gold as well. Don't care for the black so much, and I really don't like the gold, but I think this graphite and the champagne gold finish look really great. Cameras are tools first and foremost. A lot of times the aesthetic qualities of the camera oftentimes get overlooked. And I think when you look at the Contax T2, that's just simply not the case. And we're going to talk a little bit why that I think that is. We should probably point out that this is a titanium body. The outside shell of the Contax T series, it's made from titanium. Titanium is a really cool material that in the 1980s, 1990s, the world was buzzing, right? It was the material used to make the SR-71 Blackbird, and there were several camera manufacturers that sought to use this exotic material to, I guess, denote that these camera models were a little more premium. But I think there's some qualities specific to titanium that perhaps played a role in dictating what the T2 ended up looking like. So titanium is one of the strongest metal alloys known to man, stronger than steel, lighter than aluminum. It's really good stuff, but it presents some difficulties when it comes to manufacturing goods out of it, right? It's really hard to tool. And you can look at the T2 and see that it's a lot of flat surfaces, right? There's not a lot of curve to it, not a lot of intricate detail. This would have been really easy to press out of a sheet of titanium. So I think at least some of the simplicity of Contax designs, G1, G2, T2, T3, a lot of their models, the ones that are made out of titanium, they have really simple aesthetic designs. Perhaps that's at least in part due to the difficulty of tooling titanium. But I don't think that's the only reason we got such a simple design with the T2. After all, it is a point-and-shoot camera. It's got lots of automatic functionality. Yes, there are some ability to control a few settings manually, but it's primarily an automatic camera, which means that it's not necessary to have so many buttons and dials on top of it. And the end result of all of this is a camera that looks like it was designed during the Jony Ive era of Apple instead of by Kyocera in the 1980s. And discussing build quality some, I think this is another easy win for the Contax. You can take a look at the camera and note the tight tolerances and the premium feel of a lot of the finishes. there's this rubberized grip on the front of the camera. And this camera is almost 30 years old, and the grip still feels really good. A lot of times cameras, when they're really old like this, the rubber material that the grip is made out of starts to feel really weird and age and get sticky and start to turn into some, I don't know, some primordial goop. That's not the case on the T2. Everything still feels great. And the same goes for the buttons. You can see that everything is put together really nicely and just feels really good. One thing that I do think is a little bit suspect about the build quality though, and this doesn't mean that it's made bad, it's just a design choice that I don't think lends itself to reliability. It's this lens retracting in and out. So check this out. You turn the camera on and the lens pops out. Turn it back off, the lens slides back in. It doesn't exactly inspire confidence watching that lens move in and out like that. That's just a lot of moving parts, a lot of things to go wrong, especially when you're using a camera that's several decades old at this point. So about the handling of the camera, there are a few quirks here that I think bear some discussion. You can see, and I don't necessarily know why they've done this, but the lens is actually off-center just a little bit on the camera. The lens is actually pretty close to your fingers over there near the right grip. So when you're first using the camera, at least when I was starting to use the camera, I felt like my fingers were all the time rubbing up against the lens. I'm touching the lens inadvertently. And I think if the lens was positioned more centrally, that probably wouldn't be as much of an issue. At least as far as I'm concerned, I would have much rather had the lens, if it's going to lean one way or the other, towards the left side of the camera. Most people in the world are right-handed. Putting the lens farther away from my big fat fingers would be a much preferable solution here. That's not the end of the world though, not a deal breaker, just something kind of weird. Considering the viewfinder is so small, the viewfinder is actually really clear and really easy to read. I will note that if you've got glasses, it can be a little difficult. I'm a glasses wearer, even though I don't wear them in the video. Don't want to look too nerdy. Inside the viewfinder, there are left and right arrows and a dot, which lets you know when things are in focus. And it's really neat because the camera actually sends that information back to you in real time. It's doing a constant readout. It's constantly sampling what the lighting situation is and what the focusing situation is. So pretty neat. Just a note about the focusing system though, it feels appropriate to discuss right there. So here's basically how it works. You press the shutter and then the camera very quickly focuses on what you want it to focus on and takes the picture. So that does inject a little bit of lag into the system. Nothing to worry about, but you may feel that. But back to what I was saying about the camera feeding you that information in real time. If the camera notices that you haven't used that functionality in a few minutes, it'll put itself to sleep. And then just a half press of the shutter wakes it back up. Inside the viewfinder, there are actually only 3 shutter speeds that are shown. That's 1/30th, 1/125th, and 1/500th of a second. It also shows this weird LT in there, which I don't know what LT means. I'm guessing just the L means low or something. But basically what happens is that flashes when there isn't enough light to render a good image. You're gonna get handshake, camera shake. One of my favorite features of the Contax T2 is that the aperture is set on the barrel of the lens. So if you've got the camera out and you set the aperture just by clicking it. And one of my favorite things about this though is that you can see me turning it. It's actually a mechanical link up there. It's not fly-by-wire, it's not electronic. That's one less thing I feel like would be likely to break on this camera. So it's a mechanically controlled aperture and you select it on the front of the lens barrel. Pretty cool. One notorious quirk of the Contax T2 though is this weird thing about shooting in 2.8. So apparently with the Contax T2, you can only shoot 2.8 in program mode. You'll notice when you look at the lens barrel, you can see that the 2.8 is in green along with the AF on the top of the camera. So the camera will only go into 2.8 when you're in that mode. Kind of strange, and I don't understand that limitation. But here we are. I did find though, in my time shooting the camera was pretty darn willing to go to 2.8 once you had it in automatic mode. One thing that's pretty strange and may not be immediately obvious what it is on the top of the camera is this exposure compensation wheel on the left. It's a little bit strange and a little bit weird trying to turn it, but after I struggled to figure out how to turn it, you have to kind of use your fingernail. The reason why that they've probably made it so difficult to kind of get your finger in there and turn is because they don't want you accidentally adjusting the exposure compensation wheel, which I can't tell you how many times I've accidentally bumped an exposure compensation wheel on a camera. Happens all the time. And with a camera that's likely to go inside a pocket or inside a bag or something like that, gonna be really easy to turn. So God bless them. The exposure compensation wheel is actually pretty tough to turn. But, you can stick a fingernail on it and turn it when you need to. And so you're aware of what the actual exposure reading is. You can look at the back of the camera, and behind this little glass screen, you can see that there's a green 0, which means that I didn't frig up my last roll of film. Super cool, we like that. One of the most pleasing things about the Contax T2 is how quiet the overall system is. I was honestly shocked when I first got the camera of how quiet the camera was. I shot my first roll of film on it, and I wasn't sure everything was working properly because I expected some weird, jittery, sounds like crickets inside the camera autofocusing system. Well, that just isn't present in the Contax T2. You press the shutter button and the camera focuses, just like I told you. It focuses after you press the shutter button. It's so quick and so quiet you can't even hardly hear it. And the film advance is just as quick as well. So really quiet in operation. That means this camera, at least for a street photographer, is probably a really good option. It's also super small. That's another wonderful quality for a street photographer. So let's talk a little bit about the focusing system of the camera. You can see there's really this big prominent dial over here. That's how you turn the camera on. So you switch it on and you're immediately in the green setting that says AF. And you just start clicking the button and you're getting automatic focus, right? It's focusing on what you want it to for the most part. And we'll talk more about focusing accuracy in a second, but you're getting autofocus. But you can see if you spin the wheel on around, immediately after that, there's an infinity selector. And that infinity dial means, the camera's at infinity focus. If you're wanting to shoot a landscape, you're wanting to shoot something really large, you're gonna wanna be in that setting. And when I was out in Las Vegas recently, going to some state parks out there, that's primarily where I lived. I didn't want to take a chance on the camera missing focus on my priceless vacation pics, so I kept it mostly in infinity focus. But you can spin the wheel on around and you can go all the way into 0.7, which is the close focus. There's a 1, a 2, and a 5 as well. And as long as you can kind of roughly estimate where the subject is going to be in your shot, you're probably better off using that manual focus functionality. So I promised I would talk a little bit about the focusing accuracy as well. And I'm just going to be honest with you about it. I can't sugarcoat it. If you live in the autofocus world, like if you just leave it in the green autofocus setting, you're going to miss a few shots every roll. This is 1990s, 1980s autofocus technology. It just ain't all that good, if I'm being honest. There's probably 2 out of 10, 1 out of 10 images you're going to miss focus. So if you can kind of roughly estimate where your subject is, you're better off using the manual focus. I've talked a lot about this camera, and we've already talked some about the lens. It's a Carl Zeiss lens. This camera has an absolutely mind-blowing lens. It's a Carl Zeiss Sonar Design 5-element lens, a 38mm f2.8 lens. And it's the kind of lens that you would expect to get on an SLR system at the time, something ultra premium, and yet here we have it fitted on a premium point-and-shoot camera. It's awesome. The 38mm focal length was a little bit strange to me. It's almost a standard lens. I think that was a focal length that maybe was a little more in vogue in the 1980s and 1990s. You don't see much of that now, but I didn't find it to be too limiting. I approached it kind of like I had a 35mm lens on the camera. I found the images out of the camera to have really good contrast and to be really sharp. But I'm going to stop talking about the image quality, and I'm actually going to show you some images. So buckle up and take a look at some of these. Perhaps the most important segment of this video is now the part where we talk about price. So I've told you all these wonderful things about the Contax T2, how good the image quality is, how sexy the body is, how easy the camera is to operate. Well, now the bad news, right? The camera is really expensive and there's really no way to sugarcoat it. If you want one of these cameras in decent condition, you're gonna be paying the better part of $1,000 or more for it. And the prices don't seem to be going down anytime soon. So that's something that you're gonna have to take into account. But that's not the only thing that you need to take into account, because there's a lot more to the story than that. It's really easy to think that you buy this camera and it's going to work for a really long time and you're going to get a lot of use out of it. You spend a lot of money on something, you want to get a lot of value out of it. That may not necessarily be the case with the Contax T2. These cameras are several decades old at this point, and they have one major flaw. And it's not really a flaw, it's just, I guess it's the price of doing business with cameras from this era. There's electronics inside of this camera. Little PCBs and circuits and microprocessors and little wires, and all those components are soldered together. There are solder joints that connect all those things that send the electrical signals back and forth and make the camera do all the little magical things that it does. Unfortunately, a lot of those solder connections have half-lives. The solder will not bind those joints together forever, and that's a lot of times why we see these cameras failing. I would encourage everybody who buys one of these cameras to at least get on Reddit and type in Contax T2 problems and to just read some of the issues that folks have with these cameras. You know, they're buying these cameras off eBay, they're not even using them for very long, and then they're crapping out. And that's because they've got those electronics inside them and they're just getting older. And that's what happens to old electronics. They eventually stop working. The other thing that you have to consider is how difficult it would be to get somebody to repair one of these cameras. Kyocera would probably laugh you out of the building were you to walk in with one of these and tell them to repair it. At this point, they make phones and copiers and weird stuff. They're not making cameras anymore. There may be a third party out there who's able to do something. I saw vague notions of some mysterious people in Japan who may be able to work on these cameras, but you're really taking a chance with one of these cameras. There's no guarantee that somebody's going to be able to fix the thing that happens to your camera. So just be aware. So who should buy the Contax T2? And unfortunately, despite all the wonderful positive things I've said about this camera, my answer is almost nobody. The way that I look at it is like this. You really need to have a lot of disposable income on hand to be able to justify one of these. The amount of money that you would take into a casino and be comfortable losing. Because it's entirely possible you buy one of these cameras and 3 months later it's something that you're sitting on the shelf back there like some of my toys that just doesn't work anymore. These cameras aren't going to work forever, and that's just something you should know before you take a chance and buy one. This is not the kind of camera I think that somebody should save up and buy, that they should really extend themselves to try to obtain. This is the kind of camera for somebody who has a lot of disposable income that they don't care to light on fire on this table. And I'm not going to mince words here. This is a wonderful camera. It's one of my favorite cameras I've ever owned. I love it. It's got a lot of wonderful aesthetic qualities. I think it looks great. It's a camera that I'm happy to show off, happy to be seen with. It's so simple to operate. Like I said, I've had my wife take pictures with it. I've had my daughter take pictures with it. I don't have to go through a 5-minute tutorial of how to work the camera when I want them to take a picture of me standing by something. Right? It's super simple. Right? It's a wonderfully easy to use camera. But those electrical gremlins, those problems that could pop up at any time and turn this into the most expensive paperweight that I own, the lack of ability to confidently get this camera repaired, those are the reasons why I'm selling mine. And on that bombshell, if you thought this video was cool, take a look at my video about the Contax G1. It's another awesome camera by Contax, and these are nowhere near as expensive. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.